Dr. Burt Folsom has had a long and distinguished career teaching history at Hillsdale College in Michigan, where he has educated countless classes of students on real history, not what is often rewritten and presented as history in textbooks. Dr. Folsom has written several books on economic history, including The Myth of the Robber Barons, which each of you has a copy of, in which he discusses the critical differences between entrepreneurs who built businesses through their own ideas and their own effort, and those who sought to build businesses by gaining favor with government. All of you received a copy of this earlier, and I encourage you to read it, maybe even on your trip home. I promise you'll learn things about American business that you've never heard previously. Dr. Folsom has also written another book, New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America, in which he analyzes and describes the disastrous effects of massive federal spending under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the years following the Great Depression. Please help me welcome Dr. Burt Folsom.
Thank you, Raj. Good to be here with so many students. Hey, it's history time. This afternoon I'm going to talk about textbook bias, and we'll talk some about that. But here I want to set the stage for real history. I want to start it, though, by asking you, what is the slogan that President Trump has run his campaign on? Very good. You all get A's. Make America great again. Yeah, one thing, keeping in mind I'm a historian, when you hear something like that, make America great again, the question that occurs to me is, make America great again, so at some point we were not great, then we were great, then we lost our greatness, and now we need to get it back. And so the question I have is, be thinking about is, when was America first great? See, the point is, if we can discover when America was first great, and then we can trace that greatness, then maybe we can recapture that same greatness in today's world. But if we don't understand what made America great the first time, we'll be kind of groping in the dark to try to make America great again. Well, you know, I teach taught at Hillsdale College, and Hillsdale College in Michigan takes no federal aid. They're interested in the Constitution. And so when I ask a question like that at Hillsdale College, many of them say, well, America was great from the beginning because we had a good Constitution. In other words, at the point that we had the Constitution that protects that creates limited government and gives us equal opportunity, then we were great. You know, the problem with that is that we did have slavery in those early years of our history. And it's hard to argue America was great, and yet we had the institution of slavery. At least that's a concern. And so I'd like to push it forward a little bit and look at, well, how about when we got rid of slavery, right? After the Civil War, so the 1860s. Did America become great at that point? We rid ourselves of slavery. And I want to give credit to Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln was the one who really pursued the idea of natural rights, that each human being, male, female, black, white, has natural God-given rights, and that those rights are endowed by our Creator according to the Declaration of Independence, and therefore we need to pursue that and eliminate slavery. So, good idea. So in the 1860s, possibly then, we were great, or at least pursuing greatness. The one problem I have is this, and let me say this. Abraham Lincoln, although he was very good on the race issue in the sense that he did want to limit slavery early in his career and eliminate it later in his career, was not so good on economics. Economics is very important in history, and freedom, free markets, limited government, that has a great deal to do with economics. We were building the Transcontinental Railroad. Lincoln wanted to do that. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, the idea of going all the way across the country with one railroad, from California that would eventually connect to New York, and we would transcontinental, it would connect the continent. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good idea. But Lincoln did not want to do it privately. In other words, with free enterprise. He wanted to do it with the federal government in charge, or at least the federal government giving subsidies. His idea was that we'll give railroads subsidies. The Union Pacific would have a subsidy that would be going from Nebraska, where it would start, and then go west. And then the Central Pacific would start in California. And then California would go this way. And then the idea is you'd meet. You have two different railroads, give them both subsidies. And then the railroads will meet and we'll have a transcontinental railroad. Lincoln made this statement, and I want you to think about it. Because we gave massive amounts of federal subsidies to the transcontinental railroad. The U.S. national debt in 1860 was about $60 million. And we spent that much money on the transcontinental railroads. So that's a huge amount of money for the 1860s. And Lincoln made this statement, and I quote, "If the subsidies provided are not enough to build the Union Pacific Road, ask double, and you shall have it." That's what he said to the president of the Union Pacific. He said, if the subsidies provided are not enough to build the Union Pacific, ask double, and you shall have it. And then you'll have enough to build it. Could somebody help me here? Is there a problem with that? In other words, if we're not giving you enough money, ask for more, and then we'll give it, and then that'll be enough to do the railroad. Ask double. Do we have somebody come up to the microphone here? Do we have anybody and comment on that? Yeah. Right. Do we have any students to think about that? Yeah, go ahead. Or say it out loud. I'll repeat what you say.
They just keep saying, "Oh, we don't have enough because it's never enough." I mean, who doesn't want endless amount of money? I mean, the railroad's not going to be enough. We're going to get a bit more money. We're going to, just raise people's paychecks a bit, and then we'll have enough to build the railroad. Let's raise it a little bit.
Right. Did you hear that? In other words, there's never enough, right? Oh, we don't have enough. Give us more. Oh, we don't have enough. Give us more. Yeah, that's very good. And it's interesting that you see that clearly. I think Abraham Lincoln was a very intelligent person, but he had that idea that if there's a problem, just give them more money and that will solve the problem. I say that because if we look at the Union Pacific, the way that railroad did, what I'm suggesting is America is not great yet when we're doing things like this. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to connect. If you need more money, just ask more. Well, they asked for more. So they got money and they got paid by each mile. Each time they built a mile of railroad, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, each time each road built a mile, they got paid money. It was $16,000 for the first mile, and each mile. But then if it had hilly land, because we have some mountains there, you really got an increase, see? And you asked for more for that, and they got it. So the problem here is that Lincoln was saying, okay, you asked for more. Well, the Union Pacific started out. And the Union Pacific is coming down, and it's moving across Nebraska. And the railroad's coming in. Now, keep in mind, they're being paid by the mile, and they're asking for more. The railroad begins to look like this. See, it's coming across. You see that? They just made a lot of money because there are a lot of miles. They were so sad to run out of Nebraska. Nebraska's a few hundred miles across, but we can make it more than that. We'll just keep going like this all the way across. And we were paying them by the mile, and so we have this crooked railroad going through, and it's crooked by design, and that's going through, and that's the first stage of the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, once the two railroads were starting to get close to each other, they're getting close now. See, Central Pacific is moving one way, Union Pacific's moving the other, and they're getting close. Then the Union Pacific, well, I should say this. We had the invention of dynamite. in the 1860s. And the invention was good because you could blow up hilly areas to make them flat so you could run a railroad. Okay, so we're blowing up hilly areas to make them flat so we can have a flat grade, because it's very difficult for railroads to go too much uphill. So you blow that area out, you make a flat grade. The Union Pacific could have written a book called Dynamite, Its Uses and Abuses. One of the abuses of the dynamite was when the railroads got close to each other, the Union Pacific's coming over here, they blew up the tracks of the Central Pacific. They're getting close, and they go over to the other railroad that's also getting paid by the mile. They blow up some of their tracks, and then the next morning they say, hey, they don't get any money for that mileage. We're just going to come across and get that money. So Congress was startled, and then the congressman had to get in there and say, no, we refuse to let you have any money for that. Nobody gets this money for blowing up somebody else's railroad. And so, lo and behold, the Union Pacific was told they couldn't get any more subsidies if they continued that, which is just as well because the Central Pacific was getting ready to blow up their railroad. So both of them were getting ready to blow up each other's railroad in order to claim the money and the subsidy from the government to build it. Now, the next step was the railroad's coming like this. It's coming down the line. They can't blow each other up anymore. And it goes like this. They paralleled each other. They refused to meet. And both of them claimed money for the mileage that they were paralleling each other. That's when the Congress got together and said, no money for paralleling each other. No, you have to meet at Promontory Point, Utah. Utah is where you're going to meet. Nobody gets any money for any mileage past Utah. And so lo and behold, they finally meet at Utah. And then when they finally meet, you have the ceremony where they're going to pound in the golden spike. The president of the Union Pacific got up, took the jackhammer, and swung and missed. So they turned it over to the jackhammer to the president of the Central Pacific, who lifted it up. He was laughing and said, oh, he took a swing and he missed also. So they had a foreman pound in the golden spike. They then celebrated. Somebody temporarily stole the golden spike. They did get it back, and that was the story of our first transcontinental railroad. It was so poorly built and the angles were so bad in places like Nebraska that it was hard for the railroad to make a profit. Some of the grades were still too steep. The railroad had to be entirely rebuilt. And the Union Pacific went broke and was sold to somebody else who tried to make a profit out of it. That's the story of our first transcontinental railroad. In other words, it was a disaster. It was $60 million, and we barely had a railroad that we could even operate across the country. When this happened, many American politicians, starting with President Grant, the railroad was completed under President Grant, Ulysses Grant, said, this is ridiculous, it's a disaster, we shouldn't be doing this. And I think we ought to move to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. They realized, even if we vote against federal subsidies for all sorts of enterprises, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, they may have new people in Congress and they may vote a subsidy in and spend more money foolishly. Federal subsidies do not work, and congressmen began to realize this. And so what they did was something else. Under President Grant, we abolished the income tax. We had an income tax that came in during the Civil War. We abolished it in 1872. 3 years after the Transcontinental was built. We abolished the income tax. That way, congressmen said, if somebody wants to subsidize something, they won't have the financing to do it. Besides, we have a $3 billion national debt, most of which was from the Civil War. We ought to be paying off the national debt, not taking money and taxing people to spend it to build something else, which might be incompetently done. I'm happy to report, because usually as a historian, I come with bad news. A disaster has happened. In fact, isn't that what my talk so far has been? We tried to subsidize a transcontinental railroad, and it was a disaster. I have something good to report. Congressmen took seriously what had just happened. And they said, not only are we going to abolish the income tax, we're going to try to pay down the national debt and be a country that is a country of its word, of integrity. Not owing everybody a whole bunch of money, because the debtor is a servant to the person to whom he has borrowed money, to the lender. And we don't want our country to be a debtor nation and owe money to lots of people and lose control of our destiny. For 28 straight years in the late 1800s, we had budget surpluses, and in other words, even without the income tax, just from land sales and tariffs, we took in more revenue than we were spending. We had limited government. It's really the first time in our history that we had incredibly limited government. Revenue is here, expenditures are here. 28 straight years, we eliminated 2/3 of our national debt. By the 1890s, we had $1 billion debt, which means the interest payments on that was less, which made it easier to balance the budget and have a surplus the next year. We virtually eliminated our federal debt. And what we said was, we may not become the greatest economic power in the world. England is still out there way ahead of us. But what we're going to do, we're going to trust our entrepreneurs in a free market setting to establish this country. We hope to become great. We hope to become a world power. We hope our entrepreneurs will invent products that will make the United States the center of economic activity in the world. But if we don't do it, then that's the way it goes. We're not going to try to have the government pick winners and losers, pick people to subsidize to go into different industries, subsidize them, and have disaster. We're not going to do it. We charted a course of free enterprise and free markets. And it's interesting what happened. The first thing that happened was that a man named James J. Hill built a transcontinental railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota, to Seattle, Washington. Do we have anybody here from Washington? Oh, good. And from Seattle? Have you heard of James J. Hill? No? Well, you're going to hear about him now. Yes. Have you heard of James J. Hill? What did he do? Okay. Well, that shows you. In Seattle, you need to teach about James J. Hill. James J. Hill built that transcontinental railroad from St. Paul to Seattle with 0 federal subsidies. He said, let's celebrate the free enterprise era. I'm going to build a transcontinental with 0 federal subsidies. So he goes from Minnesota all the way out to Seattle. He has 0 subsidies. And you say, well, how does he do it? He makes money on the profit on the traffic that goes on the railroad. So he develops the wheat country of North Dakota, the copper country of Montana, the timber country of Washington and the apples. And he simply has people transporting these products back east, and then he makes money on that, and he has his railroad, the Great Northern Railroad, privately built, was the only railroad to withstand the recession in 1893 that bankrupted every other transcontinental railroad. So we have 4 transcontinental railroads, 3 have federal subsidies, 3 go bankrupt, and the one that's privately funded survives and flourishes. Can you see how this reinforced the politicians and the people of the United States who said, aha, we've done the right thing? But it isn't just James J. Hill building that railroad. Other good things. Inventions. Inventions start coming out under our free enterprise system. Because what we're telling inventors and entrepreneurs is, whatever you invent, you're going to get to keep the overwhelming majority of the profit from it because the taxes are so low. We have no income tax. We have a protective tariff on some items here and there. We're selling land. We simply have so few taxes that we're telling people, you get to keep what you make. Here's what we came up with. Starting in the 1860s and early 1870s, the invention of the typewriter. Boy, that's all of our keyboards on our phones, the QWERTY, sometimes called the QWERTY system, the keyboard system, that was invented with a typewriter. You're plucking keys. This is before your time. In my era, when I was your age, we had no iPhones, and we were learning how to type on a typewriter, and we type with, and the keys would come up, and we would be able to type our term papers on a typewriter, and we couldn't correct our errors as easily as we can now. And so that was the method that was developed in the 1870s by a fellow named Christopher Sholes. One of the things that's about inventions is that the motives of the inventors are not only to reach a large market and improve the lives of people, and of course make money, but also they often are looking at other people. For example, Sholes said, I'm interested in blind people because typewriters give them a chance to communicate. If they learn the keyboard system, they can communicate instead of having to write something and have the letters be confused and you're not writing on a straight line and all that. A typewriter gives you an opportunity to do that. His daughter, Christopher Sholes, the inventor of the typewriter, his daughter said toward the end of his life, Dad, one of the great things you did was create opportunities for women. Because most women didn't have opportunities in corporate America to do very much. But the typewriter created the position of office manager. And so a lot of women who did not have economic opportunity before did with the development of the typewriter. They could become typists in corporate America. Hey, it's not the greatest job in the world, but it was employment, whereas before a lot of them had no opportunity. So what I'm saying is, you not only have something that obviously benefits lots of people, but it often benefits minorities in ways, or groups that didn't have as many opportunities before, that now do much better. The same thing is the case with the telephone, which was invented a few years later by Alexander Graham Bell. The telephone is invented. Alexander Graham Bell's mother was deaf. And he pursued in his occupation trying to teach deaf people. That got him accustomed to communicating and how to communicate. He experimented with different ways of communicating words and over a wire and this kind of thing. And in 1876, he invents the telephone. And the telephone was a tremendous invention for helping people. It was funny. The guy he called was his assistant, whose name was Watson. And Mr. Watson had this big smile on his face when he got the telephone call. I always like to think part of the smile may be because it wasn't a telemarketer who was on the phone. But in any case, you have the invention of the telephone, both of those two coming right in there. Then you have Thomas Edison and the invention of electricity. What an incredible invention. We think of so much of this with cooling our homes, but that's going to come a little bit later with air conditioning. But the electricity for lighting, the lighting that you can have with electricity, and the cheap lighting. We had kerosene that we were using before that, and of course whale oil before that, but electricity, an amazing invention in the 1880s. And that invention allows America to really go forward and improve our economic development amazingly with electricity. Also, remember, Edison invented the phonograph. The early music that we had on phonographs, on records. He invented movies, film, and all of this. So we see the development. It's interesting. Things that we associate with modern America are coming to place here in the late 1800s. This period is sometimes called by historians the Gilded Age. But this period, the late 1800s, the Gilded Age, is a period of great inventions because we had limited government. The entrepreneurs are able to keep what they want, and they do very well. I also want to mention the car. Henry Ford in the 1890s developed the automobile. And Henry Ford was working for Thomas Edison, and the two of them were friends. And it was always interesting to watch them. I mean, here you got the inventor of the automobile and the inventor of the phonograph and the inventor of the movies and the invention of electricity and all this. Often they would eat lunch together. But Henry Ford had a habit when he liked someone. He would kick them in the rear end, just come out, poof. And one time he did this in a posh New York hotel to Edison. And Edison kicked him back, and the two of them started throwing things at each other. They broke a chandelier and had to be escorted out of the hotel. It's interesting to think of this. I imagine, all of you sitting around like your mothers are there with you, and they say, there's Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. Look at them, they are great men. And then you see them and they're throwing things and kicking each other and have to be taken out of the hotel. Ford had a really interesting streak in him. He refused to eat meat, chickens. He would never eat chickens. And when they asked him why, he said, because chickens eat bugs. Now, I say this because I'm telling you, entrepreneurs are strange people. They often don't like school. They don't know a lot about a lot of things. But they have that ability to sit there and be determined to invent something that they really do know about. And Henry Ford, for example, Henry Ford said, I want to give people something they want before they know they want it. Now that's kind of amazing because entrepreneurs, like what you can do with a telephone. You know what you can do with a telephone. But you don't know, and that has obvious things, but with a car, that wasn't anything that anybody saw coming. Yeah. When Henry Ford asked people, what would you like to do to improve your transportation? They said, I want faster horses and bigger carriages. And Henry Ford said, I've got a better idea. He sat there in a garage for years working on what he called his quadricycle. And this quadricycle had, we would laugh if you see the picture of it. He used for wheels bicycle tires. And he had an engine, and he was trying to steer it and all this sort of thing. And he finally got it built. He didn't have much money. He was renting a house and a garage. And when he finally got the car running, his quadricycle, he couldn't get it out of the garage. And so he thought, I dare not turn it off or I may not get it started again. So he went out and started chopping his garage to get it open more. And he didn't kick it. He couldn't get it open, so he thought he'd take an axe to the garage. And so he began to get the whole of it. He had one of these nosy neighbors who said, oh, what's that crazy man doing over there now? Look at him. And she called the guy who he was renting the garage from and said, that Henry Ford, I've told you about him. He's a bad man and he's chopping your garage in. And so the guy came running over, and then he was furious with Ford until he saw what Ford had. A quadricycle. Wow. He says, you get there and run it. Let me help chop this thing through here to get it opening. So then Henry Ford got the quadricycle out, and this guy held the lantern while he drove it down the streets of Detroit. It starts with very small beginnings, but from that, you're saying, how does this, capitalism, our free market system, it helps others in many ways. For example, Ford hired black Americans. Almost 10% of his staff was black Americans. He paid people high wages, the 8-hour day. He paid them what was the equivalent of the $5 day, which would be like the $125 day. This was double the industrial wage most people were paid. And Henry Ford said, I want to get the best employees I can. So I'm going to reduce their hours from 10 or 9 to 8 because I don't think people are very effective working on an assembly line, making the car past 8 hours. I'm going to pay them a very good wage, and I'm going to get the pick of all the best workers in the Midwest. And sure enough, he had people lined out of his factory and would pick the best ones to come and build his automobile. He became the second billionaire in U.S. history. He not only, as I mentioned, he'd hire handicapped people. He'd have different bolts and screws and different metal pieces that go into a car, and he'd have handicapped people who were bedridden screwing those together so he could take them down to the assembly line. John D. Rockefeller, who was the first billionaire in U.S. history, who was doing kerosene and gasoline, products from oil, Rockefeller also hired a lot of black Americans. In fact, his charitable, he gave away half of his $1 billion to charity. He gave away $500 million to charity. Part of it was to encourage black colleges. He supported Booker T. Washington in Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. And then he built his own college, Spelman College, named after his wife. He was a strong Christian, and he said, "The smartest thing I ever did was make Jesus my Savior. The second smartest thing I ever did was make Laura Spelman my wife." And he named that college Spelman College for black women. He wanted to help black men and black women, so he gave abundantly to both. And I think it's kind of interesting that the literacy rate for black Americans was less than 20% after the Civil War. Less than 20%. By 1830, it was over 80%. The encouragement of people like John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford helped make this possible. I just want to conclude quickly with the airplane. That's the other great invention of the era. And that was done by the Wright brothers. But the airplane had an interesting history in that many people said about the airplane, why don't we have the government do it? And people say, why have the government do it? And the answer was, because Britain and France and Germany are experimenting with an airplane. And if they invent it, they will invent it and come over and drop bombs on us. Meanwhile, we're inventing things like telephones and Coca-Cola, which, by the way, was invented also in the late 1800s, instead of working on airplanes, and then we're destroyed and our national defense is ruined. We actually funded a fellow named Samuel Langley to build an airplane. He had 2 attempts, both of which went right up and right into the Potomac River. 9 days after his second failure, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, invented or discovered flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And their first flight went less than 1 minute. But they started, and pretty soon they had their own airport out there in Dayton, Ohio, which was their hometown, and they were able to produce for the U.S. government without any subsidy. They did it with $2,000 of their own money. They were able to produce the Wright Flyer, which was an airplane that could productively fly, and the United States became the leader of the world. I want to be open to questions. Let me just make this one summary point. America became great when America decided to discard federal controls and interventions in the marketplace. By that I mean subsidies in particular, the high taxes that go with subsidies, which force people into high brackets and discourage their entrepreneurship. When we turned our entrepreneurs loose, that is what made America great. That 20 to 30 year period in the late 1800s, the United States rises with the airplane, the automobile, the typewriter, the telephone, an array of inventions, electricity. The United States becomes the leading industrial power in the world in the early 1900s. When we veered off course from that, as we're going to see when I talk a little bit this afternoon about the Great Depression, and we start increasing the role of government, then we decline. If President Trump and others will eliminate many of the government regulations and lower the taxes, which we've already seen happen, this is the strategy that made America great the first time in the late 1800s, and I think has a good chance to do so the second time here early in the 21st century. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's like Casey Stengel said with those good New York Yankee teams he had many years ago, I couldn't have done it without the players. I couldn't have done it without Henry Ford and without John D. Rockefeller and without Alexander Graham Bell. Those are the interesting people that changed the marketplace. And I regret that we don't hear more about those in our textbooks. But I'm delighted that 200 people here and several online are going to get to hear the story today. Thank you. Do we have some questions? Let's go for it. Is there a microphone? Should they come out to the microphone here? Because we have an online audience, and if you're at the microphone, they can hear your question. That's good. Thank you.
My name's Steven. I'm from Upland High School, and I do agree with you, but eliminating certain things in the government workplace, do you still believe that, sorry, my bad, in the market, do you still believe that government has a place there or no?
Government may, let me put it this way. The best place government has is for enforcing laws and contracts. Henry Ford, for example, just give you one example. Henry Ford had a great problem. He invented the automobile, and then he had some copycats come along and claim the patent that he was using. It went to court, and Henry Ford won the case. You have to protect people's patent, like the telephone or anything. You have to allow people to profit from their invention. And yes, there's a definite role for government there. There may be a role for government on certain regulations, but it's often amazing how, for example, like building codes. That seems like an obvious one, right? Because we're building skyscrapers at this time. We need building codes. Often when government comes in and starts doing building codes, what we found is the owner will bribe the government official, and the building ends up just as bad as if there'd never been any intervention. Often what helps with things like building codes, I use that as just an example, is that if you have a group of people who are experts on building codes and work for private companies, a variety of different companies, and you say, your building, your plans and all that have to pass inspection, and if they do, this group will certify that you are building a good building, then that works better than having government officials come in and stamp approval or disapproval, because so often the bribery that can occur with the government officials. So I'm saying, often when we think we need government, there are other ways to do it better. I would not rule out the possibility completely of having government intervention in some areas. Often Congress can set laws that might be useful too. They tried that, though. It's interesting. They tried it with hours of work, and they started with women. They said women cannot work more than 10 hours a week, or 10 hours a day on jobs. Now, that may be a good idea. That's a lot of time to work, but who should be a better evaluator of that? The woman who's doing the work and her employer, or her husband, or her family, or whoever. Should they make that decision, or should government make that decision? Government has come in, and some of those laws sound like they're good, but once you give the government power to say 8 hours, then why not say 6 hours or 5 hours? We've had that in France, where we've had government say, no, you can't work too many hours. Well, that then discourages entrepreneurship. There's a tendency, once you get government in, for unintended consequences to happen, and it doesn't work very well. But that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, I have a question on current subsidized programs we have now. Currently, Amtrak is a big company that's almost the backbone, and it's monopolized the railroad industry, but it's also losing hundreds of millions of dollars, like just on their food and beverages alone. What can we do to stop these subsidies without taking away major railroad businesses?
That is a very good question. I like that, because the assumption of that question, and here's where I like it the way you did that, is if we took the subsidy away, then we wouldn't have the rail service. But let's put it this way. We have the U.S. mail, which had a total monopoly for a long time. The last few decades, FedEx has come in and UPS. All of a sudden, there's competition. And without a subsidy, FedEx and UPS have been earning money for their investors year after year with no subsidy, and the post office with a subsidy has been losing so much money that now apparently we have billions of dollars in pensions and unfunded liabilities in the post office. So what I'm suggesting is that if you privatized Amtrak, the train service, and that they would figure out efficiencies. I say this because the last time I rode Amtrak, they had a glitch because the conductor's paid whether he is a good conductor or not. He didn't take my ticket. I could have gone in at the end and cashed that and said, hey, I didn't go on this, and gotten a refund. But see, the conductor is paid by the government whether he collects tickets or not. He took a few, didn't take a few. And so what I'm suggesting is when the government operates something, there are inefficiencies built into it that are not the case with private enterprise. And so, I think that if we could privatize Amtrak, we'd still have a train service, and it would probably be run better and maybe cheaper.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Next question.
Hi, my name is Blake Zari. I'm from Thousand Oaks High School.
Sure.
My question kind of goes along with the modern day version of like the railroad. So do you think that aerospace companies such as SpaceX and Boeing should be receiving subsidies from the government to make rockets and space shuttles? That's
a good question. Like SpaceX and Boeing, what about them? Should they be receiving subsidies? Boeing is huge, and it has only one competitor. It has a major foreign competitor, but it doesn't, for a lot of the space ideas, it doesn't have a lot of competition. And it gets a lot of subsidies, especially from the Export-Import Bank. And a lot of these subsidies allow them to be generous with their employees, but I'm not sure it does much for the taxpayers. The SpaceX, so in other words, I think Boeing ought to go it privately. SpaceX is interesting because they're already getting some subsidies. So the question is SpaceX going to be successful? I'm a historian, I look at the past. Sometimes when I try to look into the future, my record, let's just say, is not so good. Elon Musk is a fascinating person. There are times I read what he says and I think, boy, that guy's on target. And then the other times I see the subsidy cycle in him too. It's hard to know what to make. What do you think about Elon Musk?
I think the way he runs Tesla is pretty poor because they're losing money every month and on their quarterly reports, and their stock's still going up. So I'm not really sure how that company's functioning. But I think he's like a really smart guy, and he knows how to manage a team. But I'm not really sure how his companies are being run.
I think it's fair to say, hey, it's too early to tell, but generally speaking, it's a bad idea to subsidize. The subsidy always produces inefficiencies. Once you get the subsidy, see, your incentive then is to contribute to political campaigns so that they will keep giving you more subsidies, rather than produce a product that will be really outstanding and not need a subsidy. That makes me skeptical of Elon Musk, but I do like some of the things he says. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
This question is from one of our online attendees,
okay.
Ron from Pasadena, California. Said, I'm getting ready.
Oh, hi, Ron. Yeah.
Said, I'm getting ready to go to college to prepare for a career in a STEM field. Do you think there is a reason to consider studying liberal arts instead?
Oh, gee, that's something that my colleagues and I deal with regularly. STEM fields are, the engineering and the tech areas, mathematics, science, are good because often distortions are harder in those fields. Not impossible, as we've seen, but it's harder to distort. And so therefore, a lot of these fields, some of which you can learn online, you can learn a lot online. Liberal arts is valuable in that it can teach you about humanity and as human beings, what makes us tick? How do we respond? We can ask important questions. The problem is that it's been hijacked by the left. So the questions that what we're seeing is not an open inquiry. See, when I came into studying history, I had a lot of liberal professors. But I'm standing here, they gave me a PhD. That tells you something right there. In other words, they said, we don't like Folsom, and we think that once he grows up, he will see the light. I know they would be disappointed. If you're online watching, I'm sorry. But, they were willing to say, you know what, his ideas have supporting evidence, and I'm going to pass him through. I'm going to give him that PhD. Everything I can see, it is the saddest thing to watch this, it's different today. And I talk with many people who say, if I don't say politically correct things, if I would dare say the things you're saying, there are no professors that would be my advisor, and there are no professors that would pass me when I have to go through PhD orals. That's really quite an experience. You have your 4 top professors standing around, and they can ask you anything they want. In other words, they can fail, and anybody would fail under that. But that's the sad thing is, if the professors are going to be mean, they could ask obscure questions and flunk anybody. That's what's tending to happen. So I would say stick with the STEM field, but if you are gifted in the area of history and literature, I think that's wonderful, and I want to encourage you, but you will have more obstacles than I had.
Hi, I'm Katrina. I'm from Carlsbad, California, Pacific Ridge School. And when you speak about small governments and you speak about limiting the government and I guess their position in our economic system, where would you say the distinction between that and being a libertarian comes into play?
Sort of, what's the difference between a conservative and a libertarian?
Sort of,
because
yeah.
on economic issues, they're very similar. Where you sometimes get differences are in the social issues. And the social issues have the value that you put on liberty. To a libertarian, the highest ideal is liberty. And I think that liberty is a very high ideal. Part of my argument here is that the Constitution provided us a great deal of liberty, and that when we reduced regulation and taxation in the late 1800s, America just took off into great growth. So I think that's wonderful. But often, as a Christian, I see the need to put God first. And once you put God first and you read that, first of all, you find that liberty is very high. You look at the parable of the talents, things like that. You see a high premium on liberty because, after all, the way that one comes to salvation in Christianity is through a free will decision to accept Jesus Christ. That's a free will. Nobody's forcing you. When people left Jesus, he didn't call them back because they didn't like what he was saying. He didn't say, come back, I'll try to give you something. I have a subsidy for you. Or I'll be nicer, I won't say what I'm saying. He never talked that way. He let people come, he encouraged them, but if somebody wanted to walk away, he let them walk away. And that is I think that liberty is a very, very strong value. In that respect, conservatives and libertarians are hand in hand. Sometimes you get over issues like legalized prostitution, legalized drugs, and this sort of thing. Christians tend to say that I think, especially if we have so much, the public schools are so much in control of leftists, that we need to have, we can't be surrendering a lot of further rights, and therefore, although they like private schools, they're not quite as inclined to value liberty sometimes over various moral issues. And that sometimes separates conservatives and libertarians. It gets down sometimes to an issue-by-issue basis, and most of the time I think conservatives and libertarians are in agreement. Occasionally they're in disagreement. When they are, it's almost always over the moral, the social issues. Thank you.